It was just after 5 p.m. on a cold Friday afternoon in January. Moments earlier, Hexham town center looked the way it usually does at the end of a school day. Teenagers drifting between shops, people finishing work, parents heading home before dark. Then suddenly, the normal noise of the street was broken by screaming. People nearby turned toward a narrow alley just off Priestpopple Street. Inside the alley, a teenage girl was lying on the ground. A boy was trying to pull someone away from her. Bystanders rushed forward. Someone shouted for help. Another person called emergency services. Within minutes, police and paramedics arrived. But by then, the damage had already been done. The girl was 15-year-old Holly Newton, and the person responsible wasn't a stranger. It was someone she once trusted, her ex-boyfriend. Cases like this raise difficult questions about relationships, warning signs, and how situations can escalate in ways no one expects. If you're interested in real cases like this and the investigations behind them, consider subscribing. We explore the details behind stories that often leave communities searching for answers. Because what investigators would soon try to understand was how a teenage relationship, something that had once looked completely ordinary, ended in a violent attack in the middle of a busy town center. And as detectives began reconstructing the timeline, they discovered something unsettling. This tragedy hadn't started in that alley. It had been building for months. On the afternoon of January 27, 2023, Hexham Town Center looked exactly the way it usually does at the end of a school day. Students from nearby schools moved through the shops and cafes along Priestpopple Street. Groups of teenagers laughed with friends while deciding where to go next before heading home. It was an ordinary moment, the kind that rarely stands out. Hexham isn't a large city. It's the kind of place where people recognize familiar faces and where teenagers often gather in the town center after school. Most days, nothing unusual happens here. But just after 5 p.m., something did. People walking near a narrow alley suddenly heard screaming. Some stopped and turned toward the sound. Others hurried closer, trying to understand what was happening. Within moments, the calm atmosphere of an ordinary Friday afternoon had completely changed. Inside the alley, a teenage girl was lying on the ground. Bystanders rushed forward. Someone tried to pull another person away from her. Others shouted for help. Someone called emergency services. The girl was 15-year-old Holly Newton. Paramedics arrived quickly, and police began securing the scene. But it soon became clear that what had happened inside that alley was extremely serious, and the person responsible wasn't a stranger. It was someone Holly knew. Her former boyfriend, 16-year-old Logan MacPhail. Investigators would later determine that Logan had approached Holly nearby and asked to speak with her privately. He led her into the alley beside a pizza shop. What happened next lasted less than a minute, but it would leave a lasting impact on the entire community. The location itself made the crime even more shocking. This wasn't an isolated street or a remote area. It was a busy part of town, in broad daylight, surrounded by shops and people going about their day. Within hours, news began spreading through Hexham and nearby Haltwhistle, where Holly lived. Both communities are relatively small and closely connected. Many residents either knew Holly personally or knew someone who did. As the details began to emerge, the reaction was one of disbelief. How could something like this happen between two teenagers? In the days that followed, flowers and tributes began appearing in the town center. Schools spoke with students about what had happened. Parents and teachers tried to answer questions that were difficult to explain. Because the attack happened in such a public place, many people had either seen parts of it or heard the aftermath unfold. The investigation would eventually reveal that the events of that afternoon were not as sudden as they first appeared. There had been warning signs. There had been growing concerns. But on that January day, those warning signs were not yet widely understood. To the people of Hexham and Haltwhistle, the attack seemed to come out of nowhere. And that raised a troubling question. If this tragedy appeared so sudden to the outside world, what had actually been happening in Holly Newton's life before that day? To understand why this case affected so many people, it helps to understand who Holly Newton was before the headlines and courtrooms. Holly grew up in Haltwhistle, a small rural town in Northumberland, in the northeast of England. It's the kind of place where life moves at a slower pace. Families often know one another, and young people grow up surrounded by the same classmates, neighbors, and local shops. In a town like Haltwhistle, people tend to remember each other. And by all accounts, Holly left a strong impression on those who knew her. She was described by friends and teachers as kind, thoughtful, and empathetic. Not necessarily the loudest person in the room, but someone people naturally felt comfortable around. Teachers later said she was hardworking and dependable, the kind of student who showed up to class ready to try her best. Like many teenagers in the area, Holly attended Queen Elizabeth High School in nearby Hexham. The journey between the two towns was a normal part of daily life for local students, and after school, many of them would head into the town center to spend time with friends. Holly was no different. She enjoyed typical teenage routines, meeting friends after school, walking through the shops, grabbing something to eat, and just spending time together before heading home. Outside of school, Holly had a number of interests that kept her busy. She enjoyed dance and sports, and she had a close circle of friends who were a regular part of her life. People who knew her often described her as someone who was loyal and supportive, the type of friend who would listen when someone needed to talk. It was that personality, warm, dependable, and easy to talk to, that made her well-liked among her peers. At some point during her teenage years, Holly also entered her first serious relationship. She began dating another teenager named Logan MacPhail. The two had met through youth activities, including Army cadets, where young people from the area often spent time training and socializing together. At the beginning, their relationship appeared to be what many people would expect from teenagers: two young people getting to know each other, spending time together, and navigating the normal ups and downs of young relationships. For a while, nothing about it seemed particularly unusual. But over time, things started to change, and what began as a typical teenage relationship would eventually take a very different turn. A turn that investigators would later describe as increasingly controlling, possessive, and obsessive. The question is, when did that shift begin? Holly Newton first met Logan MacPhail through the Army Cadets, a youth program where teenagers take part in training exercises, outdoor activities, and group events. For many young people, it's also a place where friendships and relationships form naturally. That's how Holly and Logan got to know each other. At the beginning, their relationship seemed typical: two teenagers spending time together, messaging, and navigating the normal dynamics of a first serious relationship. Friends and classmates saw them as a couple like many others at their age. The relationship continued for around 18 months. But according to evidence later presented in court, things gradually began to shift. Friends noticed changes in Logan's behavior. What may have initially seemed like normal teenage insecurity started to appear more intense. Reports later described him becoming increasingly jealous, particularly when it came to Holly's friendships. Over time, that jealousy began to show up in more controlling ways. Friends later said Logan would monitor Holly's social media activity, paying close attention to who she spoke to and what she posted online. Situations that might normally be small disagreements between teenagers were starting to feel more serious. For Holly, the relationship began to feel uncomfortable. The pressure and attention were becoming difficult to manage. Instead of feeling supported, she began feeling watched and questioned about her interactions with others. Eventually, Holly made a decision. She ended the relationship. For many teenagers, breakups are emotional but temporary moments in growing up. Most relationships end with distance, time, and eventually moving on. But in this case, things didn't end that way. Logan struggled to accept the breakup. Instead of stepping back, his behavior began to escalate. And what happened next would start to raise concerns, not only for Holly, but also for the people closest to her. After Holly ended the relationship, the situation didn't simply fade into the background. In many breakups, especially among teenagers, emotions can run high for a while before things settle down. But in this case, the tension didn't seem to ease. Instead, Logan MacPhail continued trying to contact Holly. Messages and attempts to communicate reportedly continued after the breakup, even though Holly had made it clear that she wanted space. At first, this may have seemed like someone struggling to move on. But over time, the pattern started to feel different. Holly began telling friends that Logan's behavior was making her uncomfortable. According to accounts later shared in court, she said she believed he was basically stalking her. She felt like he was paying close attention to where she was and who she spent time with. Friends noticed that the situation was weighing on her. What had once been a normal teenage relationship had turned into something that felt tense and unsettling. People around Holly also began to notice changes. Logan was reportedly appearing in places where Holly was spending time. For a teenager already trying to distance herself from the relationship, that kind of attention could feel overwhelming. Holly didn't keep those concerns to herself. She spoke to friends about how uneasy the situation had become. Eventually, those concerns also reached her family. On the day of the attack, Holly's mother, Makala Trussler, contacted police because she was worried about Logan's behavior toward her daughter. From her perspective, something about the situation didn't feel right. At that moment, however, there was no ongoing police investigation. The concerns had been raised, but events were already moving forward quickly. In situations like this, warning signs can sometimes appear scattered or unclear while they're happening. It's often only afterward, when people look back at the timeline, that those signals start to form a clearer picture. And in this case, the timeline was about to reach a turning point, because the next day would unfold in a way that no one in Hexham expected. If Logan's behavior had already begun to escalate, what exactly happened on the afternoon of January 27th? Friday, January 27, 2023, began like a typical winter school day in Hexham. At Queen Elizabeth High School, students moved through their normal schedule of classes. By the afternoon, attention was already shifting toward the weekend ahead. When the school day ended at around 3:25 p.m., students poured out of the building and into the cold January air. Among them was Holly Newton. Like many students in the area, Holly and her friends headed into Hexham town center after school. It was a common routine, spending time walking through the shops along Priestpopple Street, chatting and enjoying the freedom of the end of the school week before heading home. To anyone passing by, it looked like an ordinary afternoon. But at roughly the same time, someone else was arriving in town. At around 3:45 p.m., Logan MacPhail arrived in Hexham. Investigators would later learn that he had brought a kitchen knife from home with him. Exactly what he was thinking at that moment would later become a central question during the investigation and the trial. What is known as what happened next. Around 4:10 p.m., CCTV cameras captured Logan moving through the town center. At some point during that time, he spotted Holly among the crowds of students and shoppers. From that moment on, he began following her. Over the next 45 to 60 minutes, Logan moved through the streets of Hexham behind Holly and her friends. CCTV footage later reviewed by police showed him walking through the same areas they visited, keeping them within sight. To the people around them, nothing appeared unusual. The town center was busy with students and residents moving between shops. Logan blended into the background of that crowd. But investigators later argued that what the footage showed was not coincidence. Prosecutors described it as stalking. During that entire period, Holly and her friends appeared unaware that Logan was nearby. They continued moving through the town center, talking and spending time together the way they normally would. For nearly an hour, the distance between them remained, until eventually, that changed. Because at some point that afternoon, Logan decided to stop following from a distance and approach Holly directly. And when he did, the events of the day would take a sudden and devastating turn. After following Holly through the town center for almost an hour, why did Logan finally decide to approach her? By the late afternoon, the streets of Hexham were beginning to thin out as people headed home. Some of Holly's friends had already started leaving the town center, and by around 5 p.m., she was walking with just one friend near Priestpopple Street, one of the main shopping areas in town. It was at this point that Logan MacPhail finally approached her. According to witness accounts later presented in court, Logan walked up to Holly and her friend at around 5:05 p.m. His approach didn't immediately cause alarm. He reportedly asked Holly if they could talk privately. Moments like this can be difficult to interpret in real time. For many teenagers, conversations after a breakup are not unusual. Holly agreed to speak with him. The two walked together a short distance away from the main street, about 20 meters, into a narrow alley beside a pizza shop just off Priestpopple. Her friend remained nearby. At first, it likely appeared to be a conversation. Witnesses later described seeing the pair in the alley speaking with each other. But what happened next unfolded very quickly. At approximately 5:10 p.m., Logan pulled out a knife. The attack that followed lasted around 1 minute, but it was extremely violent. During that short period, Holly suffered 36 knife wounds, including injuries to her hands and arms that investigators later identified as defensive wounds, indicating she had tried to protect herself. The sudden violence drew attention almost immediately. People nearby heard shouting and screams coming from the alley. One teenage boy rushed forward and attempted to intervene, trying to pull Logan away from Holly. During the struggle, Logan also stabbed the boy, leaving him seriously injured but alive. As the noise and chaos spread, more bystanders began moving toward the alley. Several people rushed in and managed to pull Logan away from Holly, stopping the attack. For those who witnessed those moments, the scene was chaotic and confusing. What had been a normal Friday afternoon had suddenly turned into a life-threatening emergency. Emergency services were called immediately. Within minutes, police and paramedics were on their way. But for investigators arriving at the scene, the immediate question was clear. What exactly had happened in those few minutes inside the alley? And how could they reconstruct the events that led up to it? In the moments after the attack stopped, the scene in the alley was chaotic. Bystanders were trying to help Holly while others called emergency services. Within seconds, multiple calls began coming in to dispatch. People nearby had heard screams, seen the struggle, and realized something very serious had just happened. Paramedics were among the first to arrive. At around 5:17 p.m., emergency crews reached the alley off Priestpopple Street. They immediately began treating Holly at the scene before preparing to transport her to hospital. Because of the severity of her injuries, she was taken to the Royal Victoria Infirmary in Newcastle, one of the region's major trauma centers. Doctors worked to save her life, but the injuries were extensive. Holly had suffered catastrophic blood loss, and despite medical efforts, she later died from her wounds. Back in Hexham, police were already securing the scene. Witnesses who had been nearby began describing what they had seen. Several people had observed parts of the confrontation or had heard the screams that drew them into the alley. Their accounts helped investigators form an initial picture of what had happened in those final moments. One detail was immediately clear. The suspect had not fled far. Logan MacPhail was arrested that same evening. With the scene secured and the suspect in custody, investigators from Northumbria Police began the next stage of the process, gathering evidence that could explain exactly how the events of that afternoon had unfolded. Given the location of the attack, detectives knew they had an important advantage. Hexham Town Centre is covered by a network of CCTV cameras. Shops, streets, and public areas throughout the area are regularly recorded, meaning there was a strong chance that parts of the timeline had been captured on video. Officers began collecting footage from cameras across the town center, reviewing recordings from shops and street cameras along Holly's route that afternoon. Piece by piece, the investigation started to reconstruct what had happened before the attack, where Logan had gone, when he had arrived in town, and how long he had been nearby. What the footage would soon reveal was something far more deliberate than a sudden confrontation, because once detectives examined the CCTV and forensic evidence, it began to show that the attack may not have been spontaneous at all. In the hours and days after the attack, investigators began assembling the pieces of what had happened in Hexham that afternoon. One of the most important sources of information came from CCTV cameras throughout the town center. Because the attack occurred in a busy public area, multiple cameras had captured Logan MacPhail moving through the streets earlier that day. When detectives reviewed the footage, they were able to build a timeline. The recordings showed Logan arriving in Hexham earlier in the afternoon. At first, he appeared to be moving through the town center, like anyone else. But as investigators examined the footage more closely, a clearer pattern began to emerge. Cameras showed him spotting Holly and then remaining in the same areas she and her friends were visiting. Over the next 45 to 60 minutes, he could be seen walking through several streets in the town center while keeping Holly within sight. To investigators, the footage suggested that Logan had been following her movements through town rather than encountering her by chance. Why on earth would a teenage boy do that? This timeline became a key part of the prosecution's case. Investigators also examined the weapon used in the attack. The knife had snapped during the assault, leaving part of the blade broken. Police were able to trace the weapon back to Logan's home, identifying it as a kitchen knife taken from his house before he traveled to Hexham that afternoon. Forensic analysis added another layer of evidence. A post-mortem examination confirmed that Holly had suffered 36 knife wounds, including injuries to her hands and arms. These were identified as defensive wounds, suggesting she had tried to shield herself during the attack. Witness accounts helped confirm the sequence of events seen on the CCTV footage. People who had been nearby described hearing the confrontation and seeing Logan lead Holly toward the alley before the attack began. Investigators also looked at digital evidence, including communications between Logan and Holly after their relationship ended. These records showed that he had continued contacting her despite the breakup, reinforcing concerns that his behavior had become increasingly persistent. Taken together, the evidence painted a clearer picture. From the prosecution's perspective, the timeline suggested that Logan had traveled to Hexham with a weapon, located Holly, and followed her through the town center before approaching her. In court, prosecutors would argue that this series of actions demonstrated planning rather than a sudden loss of control. But the defense would present a different explanation. Because once the case moved into the courtroom, the central question became how Logan MacPhail himself would explain what had happened that afternoon. With this evidence laid out by investigators, what would Logan say in his own defense when the case finally went to trial? The case against Logan MacPhail eventually moved to Newcastle Crown Court in 2024. By this point, the investigation had produced a large amount of evidence: CCTV footage, forensic findings, witness statements, and digital records documenting the relationship between Logan and Holly. The trial would focus on one central question: was the killing a planned act of murder or a sudden loss of control? Logan MacPhail admitted that he was responsible for Holly's death. In court, he pleaded guilty to manslaughter, acknowledging that he had carried out the attack. However, he denied the charge of murder. His defense team argued that his mental state played a major role in what happened that afternoon. Court records noted that Logan had been diagnosed with autism, learning difficulties, and a significant speech impediment. His lawyers suggested these conditions affected his ability to regulate intense emotions and respond to stressful situations. According to the defense, Logan claimed that during the confrontation with Holly, his mind went blank. They argued that the attack was not something he had planned in advance, but rather a moment where he lost control during an emotional confrontation. The prosecution presented a very different interpretation. Prosecutors argued that the evidence showed clear signs of premeditation. They pointed to the fact that Logan had taken a kitchen knife from his home before traveling to Hexham. They also highlighted the CCTV footage showing him following Holly through the town center for nearly an hour before approaching her. From their perspective, these actions demonstrated that Logan had time to think about what he was doing. During the trial, the jury was shown detailed timelines constructed from CCTV footage. These recordings tracked Logan's movements through Hexham and showed how he remained close to Holly's group throughout the afternoon. Forensic experts also described the injuries Holly sustained, including the 36 knife wounds and the defensive injuries to her hands and arms. Witnesses who had been in the area described what they had heard and seen during the attack. Over the course of the trial, the jury listened to weeks of testimony and examined the evidence presented by both sides. They were asked to consider not only what happened in the alley that evening, but also the events that led up to it. The stalking captured on camera, the knife brought from home, and the violent nature of the attack itself. Eventually, the responsibility for deciding Logan MacPhail's fate rested with them. After hearing all of the arguments and reviewing the evidence, what conclusion would the jury ultimately reach? After weeks of testimony and careful review of the evidence, the jury at Newcastle Crown Court reached its decision. On August 29, 2024, they returned their verdict. Logan MacPhail was found guilty of murder. The jury also found him guilty of wounding with intent for the stabbing of the teenage boy who had tried to intervene during the attack in the alley. The verdict meant the jury had rejected the defense argument that the killing was the result of a sudden loss of control. Instead, they accepted the prosecution's case that the evidence pointed to a deliberate and sustained act of violence. Several weeks later, the court reconvened for sentencing. In late October 2024, Logan MacPhail appeared again before the judge at Newcastle Crown Court. By that point, he was 17 years old. The court sentenced him to life detention, with a minimum term of 17 years before he could be considered for release. During sentencing, the judge described the attack as being driven by jealousy and resentment following the breakdown of the relationship. The court also noted the evidence that Logan had brought a knife from home and followed Holly through the town center before confronting her. For Holly's family, the courtroom proceedings were an incredibly difficult moment. Her mother, McCullough Trussler, delivered a victim impact statement describing the loss of her daughter and the lasting effect the crime had on their family. Statements like these are often some of the most emotional moments in a trial, offering the court a glimpse of the personal devastation behind the legal case. In the months after the trial, Holly's death continued to resonate far beyond the courtroom. Her mother began speaking publicly about the case and campaigning for changes in the law surrounding teenage relationships. One of the key issues she raised was that, under existing UK legal definitions at the time, the killing was not automatically classified as domestic abuse because Holly was under the age of 16. For many people following the case, this raised broader questions. If the same warning signs, jealousy, control, stalking, can appear in teenage relationships as they do in adult ones, should the law treat them differently? Holly's story became part of a wider conversation about stalking, coercive control, and relationship violence among young people. Communities in Hexham and Haltwhistle continued to remember her through memorials, tributes, and discussions about how such tragedies might be prevented in the future. For investigators in the courts, the case reached its legal conclusion with the verdict and sentencing. But for Holly's family and community, the impact of what happened on that January afternoon would continue to be felt long afterward. Because looking back at the timeline, the evidence revealed that there had been warning signs before the attack ever happened. Which leaves one difficult question that many people still ask when reflecting on this case. If those warning signs were already there, could this tragedy have been prevented? We share stories of true crimes like this. Follow us for more.